Big cup and hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Gilmore Way Podcast. This week, we're going to be talking about architecture, interior design, and urban planning as it pertains to Gilmore Girls. We'll be looking at how spaces and dwellings reflect the personalities of our character and what that says about them, as well as the unique appeal of Stars Hollow as a place to live. We'll be contrasting the eclectic coziness of Lorelai's house with the formality of the Gilmore mansion, and looking at Luke's minimal practicality, Suki's infusion of masculinity to her house when Jackson moves in, Logan's swanky pads, renovations to sex houses, and Emily's attempts to employ Marie Kondo's decluttering methods.
But before we get all into that juiciness and all of those fun things, if you could please just quickly do those YouTube-y things for us. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, share it with your friends who love Gilmore as much as we do, especially now that we are heading into fall and it is officially Gilmore Girls rewatch season, although when is it? Never not. We would really appreciate all of that. Any and all support really helps us out and we're always so grateful for it. Let's get into our synopses.
All right. The first episode this week, one of my favorites, Season 4, Episode 3, The Hobbit, The Sofa, and Digger Styles. Suki suggests that she and Lorelai start a catering company as a way to bring in some extra money before her baby is born, and she ropes Lorelai into planning Aaron Thompson's 8th birthday party with the Lord of the Rings theme. Rory and Paris are adjusting to life at Yale, and when it's announced that there will be a party on their floor, Paris urges Rory to agree to let them open the door for the party, and Rory initially wants to refuse, but Lorelai talks her into it by telling her that she should have some fun at college too. Emily sneaks into Rory's dorm while she's out in order to take measurements so that she can refurnish the place with $25,000 worth of furniture and stereo equipment. Smells like guilt and Chanel No. 5. Jason Stiles, the son of Floyd Stiles, who used to be Richard's boss, comes to Richard with a proposition. He wants to be his business partner because he's sick of working for his dad and living in his shadow.
This is followed up by Episode 4, Chicken or Beef, and Rory is home for the weekend, but things get awkward when she realizes Dean will be celebrating his wedding in the town square. It gets even more awkward when she runs into Dean and he invites her and Lorelai to join the festivities. Dean gets a little too drunk at his bachelor party and he starts talking about Rory. So Luke lets him crash in his apartment and tells Rory that that they shouldn't go to the wedding. Meanwhile, Kirk installs an obnoxious alarm system for Lorelai to keep her safe now that Rory is off at college.
I love that storyline, but I hate the cold open with the alarm.
We've
been over this in our special episode where we give out awards.
Mm-hmm.
I shouted that out. So if you've been here before, you know this about me. But I do love that Kirk decides to break in and install an alarm system because Lorelai is now a single woman living alone with no teenage daughter to protect her, apparently. But I would also like to point out that coincidentally, this was not planned. Laura and I are both wearing red lipstick and drinking out of our copper boom mugs from the lovely and talented Jess.
Jess, if you're watching this, and I hope that you are, even if you go back and watch after the fact on Fridays, thank you for all of the swag that you continue to keep us in coffee with, so to say. And we will see you in 3 weeks, and we're so excited about it.
Ooh, yay. Yeah, so let's get into this. I think this is an interesting time to talk about basically like how our spaces, our physical spaces and our dwellings reflect our personalities and how that translates to the show and the characters' personalities and their growth. You know, we have the very stark difference between Lorelai's house and Emily's house that's apparent from the first episode and then just gets reinforced throughout the years. And then there's also like the emotion of place, how we feel when we enter certain spaces that hold memories for us or even others. Again, Emily and Lorelai, great examples. Lorelai doesn't like going to her parents' house. And when Emily sees the potting shed for the first time, we'll get to that more later. But I think this one's good because it sort of almost hovers under the surface until this episode where Emily comes in and very distinctly redecorates Rory's first year dorm. So it's kind of a little more prominent in this episode than most. So I thought it would be the perfect time to discuss this. And I really wanted to start kind of where it all began. Let's start with the Gilmore Mansion. what's your take on the Gilmore Mansion? Like, what vibe does it give off to you? And like, how does that play into the characters and their arcs?
I mean, it's very upscale. It's very rich, even for a property that was probably built decades, if not over a century ago, and then just upkept very well. It gives off, and understandably so to me, a very just post-colonial upper class New England vibe, where it's like, these are the people that, crossed the pond, came over the Atlantic after centuries of like their families continuing to do well. They're just loaded and can afford to build houses and mansions like this, so to say. And I would even like say this is borderline classified as a mansion, because it's just a property that, only ever housed 2 or 3 people, but could probably easily, accommodate 4 or 5 times that amount. So it's a bit ostentatious in that regard, but from an architecture standpoint, it's beautiful. It's gorgeous. Like, I would not be unwilling to live there for that aspect of it, just because it is a beautiful space, even if it is a bit too much, again, just for a smaller family, unless you have aunts, uncles, or 10 kids for whatever.
Or Berta's whole family.
Yeah, living with you. It's a space that is just cumbersome and overly large for just Richard and Emily and Lorelai, but it tracks, and that's kind of par for the course for them, because of course you're going to live in a house that's just that, like, its own display of wealth in that regard, because white Anglo-Saxon upper class rich Protestants, welcome to New England with this kind of architecture and living spaces, folks.
Yeah, you're right. It's so huge, and yet it's still so suffocating to both Lorelai and Rory, and even eventually Emily. When Richard passes and she's decluttering, she said that she wakes up in the middle of the night and feels like the house is closing in on her. She feels claustrophobic, and in season 6, Rory refers to it as like, it's a huge house, but it makes it feel Tom Thumb tiny. To be in it and like sleeping in the room next to her grandma instead of out in the pool house. Oh, I'm sorry. It's called the sex house. The sex
pool house.
The sex pool house. But yeah. And actually, going back to what you said before that, we do have information on this house and its architecture. There's the episode when they offer the house up to the Historical Society for a charity event. And the tour guide is giving incorrect information, and Richard has to correct them. So apparently it was built in 1907 by a student of a very famous architect named Stanford White, who is known for little things like the Washington Square Arch and the Boston Public Library, and several like beautiful homes in Rosecliff in Rhode Island. So he was just kind of a big deal. And yeah, so very famous architect from Manhattan, worked for a firm called McKim, Mead and White. So yeah, there's some prestige to that. Oh, and he had like the best mustache ever known to man. Seriously, go Google him. It's like, it's insane. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the house itself has a pedigree, and I love to when Luke first sees it and he walks up, he's like, "This is a house? This is what causes peasants to revolt. This is how heads end up on spikes."
I mean, he's not wrong. And Dean has a similar sentiment. Emily questions him about the house, and he's like, "It's big. It's large," and I can't fault him for that response, because it is an overwhelming space. And again, I can see how someone who doesn't come from the same amount of privilege as Emily and Richard do can walk into this house and just be like, "Really? Y'all need this? Like, are you kidding me?" And not that we should ever be judging one another unnecessarily, but I can see how it just does come across as like, there are people that are hungry in the world and 2 individuals are living here. Okay.
Yeah, it's true. I love that moment when Dean comes up and he's like, yeah, this house is huge. And Emily's like, oh, thank you. So few people notice the hugeness of houses anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not only is it large, grand, ostentatious, but it's also very formal. You know, it has a sort of separation of spaces that we don't see in a lot of houses anymore. You start to see a lot of the open concept stuff coming up in popularity in the 90s and the 2000s especially, but this house has a formal dining room, and there's that moment when Rory wants to take her muffin upstairs to her room because she doesn't want to eat breakfast with Emily, and Emily says that like food in this house is meant to be consumed in the dining room or not at all. And so it's sort of her sense of propriety about how things are done extends to her living spaces. And while most people wouldn't care about someone having a muffin in their room or taking their tea outside on the patio, Emily selectively uses it to wield as a weapon, to get people to bend to her will and do what she wants. She wants Rory to have to face her and do as Emily dictates. And so she is like, no, you will eat in the dining room. And then even when Lorelai redoes her house and Emily and Richard show up kind of unexpectedly, she's like, you're still eating in the kitchen? And she's like, we've always eaten in the kitchen. This is where the food is.
Yeah.
Lorelai's house is not large enough for a separate dining area. And most people don't really need a formal dining room anymore. We're not hosting large dinner parties like we used to. And Emily doesn't seem to get that. They have all these very like particular spaces. And there's even one, like there's the piano area, the weird piano area that we haven't really named yet, as Lorelai refers to it when Luke first comes to the house. So it's not only just straight up large and probably more than 2 or 3 people need, but it's a level of formal that we just, again, don't see anymore. Luke makes the point that like things are basically made out of cardboard, or sorry, no, actually it's Emily who makes this point. She says everything's made out of cardboard these days, and Luke says the art of craftsmanship is dead. And yeah, but we get a lot of these houses that can be slapped up in a couple of months, and they're all just made out of like wood and plaster. Nothing's made out of, you know, super high quality materials anymore. It's all just cutting corners and fitting as many houses into the suburbs as humanly possible, which crushes my soul. But this house is kind of a callback to those days of opulence and formality of homes. Actually, you and I went with some of our other friends to a beautiful stately home near where I live that's been used for filming locations. Billy Madison. If you've watched that movie, this house is Billy Madison's house. And it's beautiful. And when you take the tour of it, they tell you, like, you know, if you were a guest, you would be received in the foyer and you would leave a calling card. And then there are separate movement spaces for the family and for the servants and the staff members. There are areas for work purposes. There are men's lounge spaces and women's lounge spaces. And this house has very much that vibe, where when it was first built in the early 1900s, it was probably like that little piano area was probably the ladies' drawing room or something. And there would be other areas where there might be a pool table that would have been the man's domain. So it gives me that kind of vibe. Very swanky. We have money. We're going to build all these rooms that nobody really needs anymore. And yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a good summation of Emily and Richard's house. But I want to move us along to what immediately follows for Lorelai after that, when she chooses to depart with Rory as an infant, and she's instantly transported, not really so much by choice, but just out of necessity, into living in a shed. on the outskirts of the property at the inn that she is now employed at with a young child. Talk to me about that, because it is not even the most, like, not even a small departure. It is the most severe departure from living with Emily and Richard all these years in the house that she was, now being transported into the shed that probably had the most minimalistic of amenities, if any at all. We don't know if there was electricity in it starting out. We don't know if there was running water. I think maybe not, if I remember correctly, but it was a bare bones living situation for someone with a very, very small child and an infant who was, still so fully dependent on mom at that point. Talk to me about that, because as much as it was, again, out of necessity, do you think that there was ever a part of Lorelai that looked at that shed and was just like, oh, this is actually a breath of fresh air?
Oh, she certainly thought it was a breath of fresh air, even though it was, like you said, very minimal. It was a space that was entirely Lorelai's, and that she had some measure of control over, which was exactly what she needed. She needed to be anywhere that wasn't the Gilmore house, even if it was a tiny little shed that didn't have, or it didn't seem to have a lot of insulation even. I remember seeing it in Emily in Wonderland, and it has a tub, so it might have running water. And Lorelai really put her stamp on it by putting up a little curtain, and it was semi-functional for them, I guess, for a little while. I think we forget sometimes the riches to rags story is prominent, but I think maybe sometimes we don't fully appreciate that Rory grew up in a shed until she was probably 11. She is very much the epitome of started from the bottom, now we're here. She wasn't used to the lifestyle that Lorelai grew up in. And, we see them when they're stable by the time she's in her teens. And we forget that her upbringing was so, impoverished, really. Lorelai was probably squirreling away every cent she possibly could and making do on the bare minimum so that she could afford a house as soon as possible. And it still took her 11 years to be able to do it. And so when we talk about Rory and her privilege and her, for example, when she writes that snotty article about the rich people at Logan's work thing, and Logan has to remind her of her privilege, I get it. And I've been, judgmental of Rory for stuff like that too. She kind of really does take it up.
Yeah.
But we often forget she grew up in a freaking shed. So, yeah, what's your take on the shed and Emily's reaction to it?
Emily's reaction to it always breaks my heart, because as much as it was Emily and Richard and their behavior and their decision making and how they always treated Lorelai to an extent that drove Lorelai out of the house with, a 1-year-old Rory. It is a very emotionally driven scene, because she's recognizing, my daughter gave up such an incredible livelihood and every opportunity under the sun that was open to her to, in Emily's mind, go and live in a place like this. Was she that dissatisfied with us as people and as her mother and father and individuals in her life and the life that we have tried to give to her? We tried to give to her. And Emily, in that mind, I think, is just thinking, how did I fail? Or I did fail, but what went so wrong that my daughter thought that this was a better out than the life that she had? Because I don't think Emily is being judgmental about the living space in that moment. I just think she's remorseful that perhaps her own actions led to this, and that her daughter gave up being a part of their lives and ripped their granddaughter away from her to go live in a space like that. I think in that moment, Emily had so much to instantly contend with, and just flashing back to all of Lorelai's preteen and teenage years, thinking she chose this over us. How much did she have? How much did she hate us that she chose this path as opposed to what we have given her, and subjected herself to such a basic and banal living space? I think there was so much on Emily's mind in that moment, aside from, ugh, I would never live here. Like, who does this? This is such a horrible space. I don't think she was necessarily judging the living space so much as she was contending with just a flood of her own emotions in that moment about how perhaps she had failed as a mother, and that led her daughter to exist in a place like this for years on end, when had she and Rory wanted something better, Emily and Richard would have always provided it.
Yeah, Emily is so materialistic that she can't really contend with the fact that other people don't want what she has. And so when she sees what Lorelai chose over the comfortable materialistic lifestyle that they were living, she's like, oh, Lord. And I think it starts to hit home for her just what Lorelai was willing to do to get away from them. And you're right. She doesn't really process that emotion very well. And it results in her deciding to decorate a room for Rory. And so, back to the Gilmore house we go to talk about, when she calls Rory and she's like, what's your favorite color and what's your favorite flower and how do you feel about the Backside Boys? And then she like frames the posters and sets up a whole thing. She gets her pajamas and toothbrushes and, really makes Rory a secondary home in their house because she feels like it's a way to connect with Rory and a way to make up for her destitute childhood.
Yeah. But what do you think about Lorelai's decision in that regard? I mean, this is not the crux of this episode, but do you think that it, and we've talked about it before, I'm sure, do you think it was right to put Rory in a living space like that? Or was it neglectful, even though she had a lot going on with her own parents, to subject your child to a living space like that was so lacking for even your basic amenities?
We don't truly know how long they were in that space or what it looked like when they lived there. Maybe stuff had been taken out since, and it had been updated or retrofitted since they left it. So I don't want to go so far as to accuse her of neglect or child abuse or any of that kind of stuff, because that feels really extreme. But it does seem like their basic needs were somehow being met between the amenities of the inn and the shed. They might have been able to use facilities in the inn at certain times, and they probably got free leftover food and stuff like that. I have no idea who was child-minding Rory when Lorelai was working and how that was going. So it's really hard to tell. It's certainly not an ideal situation in which to raise a child. And this kind of goes back to things I've said before about the decision to be a parent should be made only by people who can truly support that child in every way, shape, and form, between caring for their physical and emotional needs. And anyone who's not willing or able to do that just should have the option to not be a parent.
Mm-hmm.
For, to put it in sort of basic terms without getting too descriptive or political. But just, she felt like she had to keep that kid and do whatever it took to provide for them, and look at what it did to them. And I think it's an argument for more robust government services and welfare and childcare and all of that. Your country's flipping backwards.
I was about to say, I don't know what you're talking about, because the United States is fine. We're perfect here.
You're totally okay.
Nothing is wrong. Like, Marca.
And I think a lot of people don't even realize the neglect or abuse or lack that they faced as a child until they're much older and start to process some of that trauma. Rory seemed to view it romantically, I think, because of her connection to her mom, and her mom always attempting to make things feel special even when they weren't. Just sort of that power that Lorelai has to turn the mundane into something a little more magical. And so Rory's memories of it don't seem to be tainted by that. And, eventually she does sort of pick up this higher brow lifestyle, and she seems to like it. But I'll have to think about that a little more and see what I think it may have done to her psyche, besides her whole, like, superiority over the rich complex that she and Lorelai both clearly have. So, just my quick and dirty on that one.
Yep. But as we all know, Lorelai and Rory do not exist to live in this shed forever. And when Rory is 11, 12 years old, they do finally move into the house in Stars Hollow that we see them currently existing in as of the pilot, as of season 1. What do you think about that house as it represents Lorelai as a person? Because obviously that was a house that was built not from the ground up, of her own doing, and let me design this as I want it to be. But she moved into this house, had years to make this space her own. If you were to walk into Lorelai's residence, would you say, oh yeah, this is definitely her home, and I can tell because she's made it her own space? Or do you think it's a house, but it would not be immediately distinguishable to me that it belongs to Lorelai Gilmore? And if so, what do you think she could have done in terms of that design to really make it scream, this is a Lorelai and Rory Gilmore household?
That's an interesting question. Knowing Lorelai, as I do from all these years of parasocial relationship with her, I feel like I could kind of walk in and be like, oh yeah, Lorelai lives here. Because a lot of the time it's sort of cluttered, and she has a lot of stuff that has clearly been cobbled together over the years from probably thrift store finds and in leftovers and couches she bought on credit and took several years to pay off. Not to mention we have the clown pillow. I love, was it Scott's podcast that was doing the like clown pillow sighting count? That was funny.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. The rabbi, the monkey lamp, there are so many things that have so much personality and that you could really only find in specialty stores or secondhand stores, which is probably where she's doing the bulk of her shopping, which is great financially and environmentally. So kudos to Lorelai for making use of what she has until it, like, the end of its useful life. So many of us are so willing to throw things out before the end of their useful life, just because we're done with it. And Lorelai was always very much like, I'm going to get every ounce of functionality out of this before I get rid of it. And it's an interesting way to do things. I love to thrift. I love to find books and china, glassware, silverware, photo frames. That kind of stuff is typically what I would look for at a thrift store. And I think Lorelai probably had a lot of fun shopping around for a whole house, finally, of things that were her selection. They might have been what was available, and that selection might have been limited, but she got to make that decision, as opposed to living in a very formal house where everything was just chosen by her parents and was not kid friendly. You know what I mean? She was finally able to take her style and apply it to her living space. So I think she really took it and ran with it.
Yeah.
One thing that I find interesting is when she has her first breakup from Luke and she repaints the garage. I think, I'm wondering why the inside of her house isn't more like that, but, pink and blue and gold glitter. But I think the clutter and the eclectic nature of it does scream Lorelai. It could be more Lorelai, but I'm glad it's not. Yes.
Yeah. I will say, though, it always struck me, and it was something that I was thinking about as I was just preparing for this episode. My personal opinion would be that I can walk into that house and, again, maybe pick up on a vibe that, like, oh, this belongs to Lorelai Gilmore. But specifically in the house, if I were to walk into Rory's room, I could 1,000% be like, oh yeah, Rory Gilmore. Yeah. This is your space. So it strikes me that Rory, but it's not unsurprising that I think Rory has been so diligent about making her room her own, and it really just shouts to the hilltops that it's her space. And the rest of the house is definitely a combined mutual living space for the both of them, but not something that I think represents them as efficiently and as effectively as Rory's individual room does. And it's telling to me too that even Lorelai goes so far, and we've talked about this, when she starts getting her admissions letters, to then really decorate Rory's room to like make it, emblematic of where she's going to go to school and what her life is going to look like from now on and what her future and her career path is going to be. It's not bad that she didn't, but I would have liked to have seen that creativity extend to the rest of the house, as opposed to just, it's a cute and quaint New England, moderate living space for a family, but it never really shouted them or was as creative as I think I would have liked it to be.
Yeah, I think the garage part is sort of the creativity, but the main house is, to me, it's the cozy, the inviting, the warm, the crowded with objects that make you smile. Like she compares, like when she's at Jason's house for the first time and she's like, "You're not really a tchotchke guy." And he's like, "I don't really see the need for them. I don't really have a lot of objects around that don't have a clear purpose." And Lorelai's like, "Their purpose is to make you happy." And so when you know that kind of stuff about Lorelai and you go into a house like hers, you can just feel the warmth and the care with which these things were selected. And I think that like the way that she decided to decorate comes out of her own version of conspicuous consumption, where it's like her mother uses her personal belongings to display her wealth and her good taste, her high culture, all that kind of stuff. But Lorelai very conspicuously purchases things that are eccentric or tacky as a way to differentiate herself and put as much symbolic distance between her and Emily as possible. And with the way that she uses things until their function gives out, basically, is also contrasted in Emily, who frequently changes her space simply to change it. Like she'll change the draperies, even though the ones she has are perfectly usable, even though fabrics are resource intensive to produce, hard to recycle, very expensive. And she buys a lot of antiques. Like I remember when she replaces her dining room chairs and Lorelai's like, "These look exactly the same." And she's like, "No, the backs are higher and the feet are different." And like the changes are so small that like only she knows what the change is. And she had to scour the antique shops of New England to even find them in the first place. And it's a very different mentality of like, I want something new simply because I want it, and I'm going to replace what I have that's perfectly good because I can do better. And I'm going to spend a lot of money on these glass apples from Italy that are just going to sit in the middle of the dining room table, whatever the cost, It's two different ends of that spectrum. And I think Lorelai did that very intentionally. She was like, now that this is my space, I'm going to pick things based on how offended my mom would be when she saw them.
So bouncing off of that idea, what do you think about Lorelai existing in Jason and his world and his apartment and his space? Because he has very different concepts of interior design, how his apartment is laid out. It's very clean. It's very organized. Like you said, he doesn't have riffraff, so to say, in his space. And not that Lorelai's space, she's certainly the furthest thing from like a hoarder. She doesn't keep unnecessary items within her household, and it's not congested in that way. But Jason's apartment is very meticulously designed. Again, it's just very organized. Everything that is there for a purpose because it's probably being used on a regular basis. He doesn't have things lying around just to be there. He doesn't have decor just for the sake of decor. Everything probably is there for a reason and a purpose. How do you feel like Lorelai could have potentially, if she had ever, if that relationship had gone the distance, existed in a space like that? Do you think she could have, or would she have just been like, this just is not my vibe whatsoever?
I don't know that, well, she might have been able to do it. I don't think she would have wanted to. I think she would miss the coziness factor. And I think that's part of why they were never really destined to go the distance. The only way I could see their relationship truly lasting would be if they had like a separate lifestyle. And that might work for some people if they just decided to keep their own living spaces and see each other as they pleased and spend the night at each other's house on whatever schedule they deem. I think everyone kind of has the right to set their own relationship rules and set their lives up in a way that works for them, and that might have been the solution. But you're right. His space it feels a little cold, and I think it was probably done by a designer. He probably had some say in terms of like where things are located, but we'll get to this in future when we talk about mental health and how that's talked about on the show. But a lot of people suggest Lorelai might have ADHD, and I can see it. I'm still on the fence as to whether it sort of crosses the threshold truly into ADHD, because I think it's kind of misunderstood among the general public and it's become a bit buzzy. But as someone who doesn't have a formal diagnosis and is pretty sure she has ADHD, I see a lot of red flags, shall we say, that indicate it could be possible. And I think that's kind of where we get the maximalism and the clutter. I mean, you've been to my apartment. You know how much stuff I have and how attached I am to those things. And, sometimes I get frustrated with my own stuff, but I'm also unwilling to let it go. So it can't like clutter and not being able to find things at an easy glance or easy touch is very much an ADHD struggle. If you put things behind cupboard doors, you're more likely to forget about them because of your object permanence basically is a little bit messed up with ADHD. If you can't see it, you literally forget about it. And I'm wondering if that also plays into Jason's apartment. I, again, might speculate a little more on this in the future, but I think he might also be neurospicy in some way, possibly on the autism spectrum. Again, someone who thinks they're probably on the autism spectrum sees a lot of herself in Jason. And just the fact that he kind of needs to have things be very organized. We see it with his insomnia and the fact that he can't have any distractions in his room. And I think that might extend to other areas of his home where it's like, if I can't find things, I can't function. I have to be regimented. I have these schedules. I have these routines. I have to be able to know exactly where things are. People can't change this up on me. And so, I'm not a psychologist. I can't diagnose anyone. These are fictional characters. But I see a few things where I'm like, that could be interesting. And I think that those things actually tend to run together. ADHD, they like to call it. And so it's interesting that they are sort of like opposite ends of the spectrum, which just goes to show how varied those neurodivergences are in the first place, and how you can't necessarily expect that if something's true for one person with it, that it's also true for another. It can manifest itself in various ways. So I just find it interesting that they're so different from each other and yet so similar with that. Yeah, I don't see Lorelai kind of giving up on those like little things that make her happy and bring color and spice to her life. Jason is also probably going to be overwhelmed by Lorelai's house and be like, there's like just too much stuff here. You need to declutter.
Yeah, I think in that regards, it was just maybe like a sign, and an early one at that relationship was never going to work out. But even something like, when Lorelai stays over for the first night and Jason is just like, okay, you need to go sleep in the guest room now because I need to get, a solid night of sleep. And that's your bedroom. This is my bedroom. And Lorelai's just like, wait, what? And Jason's like, well, yeah, like, that's what works for me. And I'm not faulting him for that whatsoever. If you need your own space and, you feel more comfortable sleeping in a bed alone at night, I don't think it was any, critique on Lorelai or her person. It was just, that's what was going to allow him to be comfortable as he tries and gets his rest for the remainder of the evening. It's not something that Lorelai was initially warming up to, and it's probably not something that perhaps even Jason's previous partners were probably receptive to, potentially. but he was being honest and forthright with what was going to allow him to feel comfortable within a space that was already, that's his. So, he has the right to say it, and Lorelai has the right to respond to it however she will. But I will give kudos to Jason to just acknowledging, like, this is what's going to allow me to be comfortable, and this is my apartment, and this is my space. So, if you want to talk about it, we can talk about it, but I'm just acknowledging and letting you know and trying to communicate to you, that's how I'm going to be comfortable here.
Yeah, I could see that. Another thing about the clutter, just before we move on, my other theory about why Lorelai's house is often cluttered is the fact that she grew up with maids. And so maybe she never properly had to keep up after herself. And also the formality of the Gilmore house was like, remember in Dear Emily and Richard, and she comes home and she's like, I'm dropping my sweater. I'm dropping my sweater and I'm walking away. Like,
Yep.
It's so meticulously clean because of the maids that leaving things around was not cool. And so now she has the freedom to be able to do that. And so it's just sort of like a remnant of her rebellion in the form of clutter. But the talk about Jason is a perfect segue into the concept of merging spaces with the significant other and Lorelai's house. And that brings us to the renovation from season 6 and the idea of coming together with Luke and sharing a space, because originally he wants to buy the Twickham house for them. But then when Lorelai is resistant to selling this house, Luke decides to step in and extend her second floor and renovate it so that there's enough space for both of them. He's like, that other house is too much space for us anyway. Like, it's only been his lifelong dream to live in that house because no one makes them like that anymore. And he just gives it up within 24 hours when Lorelai's like, I think we should hold on to this house and lay down some tracks. Yeah. So talk to me about the renovation and what it says about Luke and Lorelai's relationship in season 6.
I mean, we've said this before, but I feel like Lorelai is wholeheartedly the type of person that not only was going to never leave Stars Hollow, but just had such a level of comfort within her own home and within her own space that she's probably okay with spending a couple of nights at Luke's or going on a vacation somewhere and being in a hotel or a motel and existing elsewhere for a short amount of time. But at the end of the day, I feel like she was always just going to be itching to get back into her own home and into a space that provided her that level of comfort and safety. And that's why I think it was always just going to be, and it was always going to have to be a case of Luke is going to have to move into Lorelai's home. Lorelai is not going to be living above the diner, even if it is spacious enough for 2 people, because I feel like even if she could bring in some of her own personal effects, it was never going to be a space that I feel like felt like home for her. I feel like she had it. She's had it for years now. She's never going to leave it. So I think it was good that I think Luke saw that, acknowledged it, and realized, okay, I need to come here because that's what's going to work for her. How do we make this space then not only our own, because I feel like Luke has such, I don't know, not like, it's not that he has low standards, but maybe just like low expectations or needs in that regard in terms of design. He doesn't have a lot of demands that he will probably be, making in that regard. He just is happy existing with a partner. And as long as he has a roof over his head and a bed, and it's not, unicorns and rainbows on the walls, he'll probably be okay. Although, you would probably love that. But I feel like he's just a man of simple pleasures in that regard. I think that's a really good way to put it. So they did need to do some renovation work to make the space more hospitable now for an actual couple as opposed to just a mother-daughter, because there is a difference between having a 2-person household where it is a parent and a child versus a partnership at this point. Even if that child does periodically come back to visit, that space needs to accommodate those 2 people differently. The bedroom might have to be larger, the bathroom might have to be larger. in terms of decor. There probably is some give and take that needs to happen. We see that with Suki and Jackson, and we will get to it in short order. But it was good, I think, that Lorelai was at least willing to acknowledge, like, there are some changes that need to be made to my home, but they're changes for the better because of the partner that I have now.
Yeah. It's interesting. She wouldn't have had the money to upgrade her house like that without Luke. So that's an interesting thing. She probably would have been content living as she was pretty much forever. But even without Luke, she's got a bigger bedroom and a bigger closet and a bigger bathroom. So that's nice for her. I find it interesting when the reno was done and they finally picked the paint color because the first white didn't go with Paul Anka. And it's all done, and she comes up to the new house, and Luke shows her the bedroom set with the cherubs and the funhouse mirror and the 6 paintings of sailboats. I love that scene, and she clearly hates this stuff. And then she goes to Suki and says, like, oh, I hate this stuff. And she's like, look at everything Luke has done for me. He bought and unbought the Twickham house, almost bought it again, decided to live at my house because I wanted to live at my house. He turned his whole life upside down for me. He does everything in his power to make me happy and give me what I want. Can't I just give him this little thing? No, I can't. Mm-hmm. Like, she is so unable to change and to adapt and to, like, truly, like, let other people dictate anything in her life ever. She's not the most flexible person. Oh, God, I have no idea, truly. I think it probably does stem from her needing to get out of a house where everything is controlled by others, and the subsequent years of being so self-determining that it's hard to imagine anyone else in that life. It's just her and Rory. It's so insular. And it's why she struggles in the intervening years in forming and maintaining relationships up to and including Max and Alex and, her early season boyfriends and even Jason. It's just so Lorelai's way or the highway that it's nearly impossible. I mean, granted, I don't blame her for not wanting that particular bedroom set, but she recognizes the fact that, like, Luke does everything for her and she gives him, like, nothing in return. Like, what does she bring to this relationship besides her good looks and charm? I'm not entirely sure. Luke just, like, floats the whole thing, and she's just so rigid and she's like, I'm not moving. I don't need a bigger house. She says when I think it's when she's giving him the ultimatum at the end of the season, she's like, or no, it's when she's talking to Linny. She's like, I want to get married. I want another kid. I want to marry Luke. Like, I want to move forward. And I'm like, where are you going to put another kid if you're unwilling to change Rory's bedroom around? Like, when she marries Christopher and Gigi comes into the picture, she's hesitant to, like, move Rory's desk out of the room and change things around so that Gigi can live there. And I'm like, where are you going to put another kid if you stay in this house? You're going to build an annex? Like, what thought process goes on in this woman's brain just baffles me. It's she can't grapple with change ever at all. And so this is part of the reason I think that, like, Luke is the only person who can be with her, because he's just so willing to give up his own needs and wants, because there's so few, to make her happy. And it's not necessarily the healthiest thing, but at least, he doesn't chafe at it the way other boyfriends did. So,
yeah. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. There is something to be said for that. But there should always be compromise and communication. And it shouldn't just be rolling over to make your partner happy. And Luke didn't do that. He did voice dissent when things were displeasing to him. But I feel like sometimes he held back when something whether it was like interior design or otherwise, was bothering him within the relationship. He's like, ugh, I just don't want to like cause waves right now. No one ever does, but sometimes it's unhealthy to clamp that down as opposed to speaking up. So I wish I would have seen a little bit healthier communication from Lorelai and Luke in that regard.
Yeah, and then she sort of wields it as a weapon against him when Christopher calls and Luke is being bitchy at dinner with Suki and Jackson. And she's like, you want honesty? I hate the bedroom set. Like she bottles it up and lets it come out at the worst possible moment and just uses it as like, hey, let's turn this fight into something else entirely. How about that? Let's get the attention off of that infamous voicemail. Yeah, it's not the best. And she even brings it up in the ultimatum. She's like, I didn't get the purple wallpaper because you didn't like it. And he's like, I never told you not to get the purple wallpaper. And she's like, you didn't like it. So, again, it's clear that he sacrificed a lot in that renovation. I mean, we'll talk about this in a bit as well, but like his personal style is basically like leaving everything the way my dad left it. So I don't know that he has as many real strong preferences as Lorelai does. And so he might be perfectly happy being like, yeah, cool. I like everything, or it doesn't bother me at least. So it was kind of an interesting compromise, truce, whatever you want to call it, when they did that house. But that brings me to the next thing, sticking with the end of season 6 references, when Emily goes to buy them a house. Do you think they ever would have actually moved into that house?
Nope. I mean, again, Lorelai was just so content where she was. I feel like Luke might have been more willing to be like, this is an over-the-top, unnecessary gesture from Emily. And I feel like Luke would have kind of felt uncomfortable at the, I don't know, just over-the-topness of it, for lack of better phrasing. And just like, oh, like, please don't throw money at us in this way in terms of buying us this house. Like, we're not ungrateful, but it's not something that we need. And it just feels like too much for us. And it's more, I think, what Emily would want for them as opposed to what they see them wanting for themselves. But even still, I feel like Luke might have over time just been like, I don't love it, but I'll take it because it's just my mother-in-law trying to do something nice for me, for us, to try and give us a larger space. I feel like Lorelai would have just been like, across the board, nope, I'm happy where I am. I don't need my mother to spoon feed anything to me. This is why I ran away from that life that I had in the way that I did. I don't need her help. I don't want her help. I mean, even asking for the initial Chilton money was like swallowing, a pill that might have been the size of a planet for Lorelai. It was so hard to go down that I feel like she's so reticent to take anything from Emily moving forward unless it's benefiting Rory or unless she's just incredibly desperate and in need. And in this case, neither of those apply. So I feel like Lorelai would have just been like, no, Mom, like, thank you, but no, we're fine where we are.
Interesting. I somewhat disagree with you. Not that I know if they would actually end up in that house, but I think Emily was actually quite thoughtful with this house. I mean, again, very over-the-top gift, probably unnecessary. She's like, well, you wouldn't let me give you a wedding, so I figured I'd give you a house. I find it interesting that she comes to Stars Hollow and judges all the work that they did. And she's like, your wainscoting is substandard. I could have recommended a real professional, and tell me that's not veneer. And how nice it must be not to have a homeowners association. But then she's also like, this house does feel homey, and I can see you and Luke here. And Lorelai's like, this has been my home for 21 years. And it's homey because it's home, right? And then Emily and Richard go out and look for houses for her anyway, again, to kind of give her more. You know, whatever you can say about Emily and Richard, they always did want to give Lorelai a beautiful life, and there's something to be said for that. But with this house, she was like, she knows how Lorelai feels about getting stuff, and she's like, you know, I think your house is nice. I know how much you've put into it, but it's too small for the two of you, especially if you have more kids. And like Luke might need some more space. You know, he's got tools and projects. He likes to build stuff. He likes to fish. He's got gear and sporting equipment. Like, you don't have space for that. And like, I know you've always wanted horses, so I thought some property might be nice. And like, she found it in the neighboring town and was like, you know, if you grease the palm of the Stars Hollow zoning commissioner, a man named Taylor Dosey, you might even be able to get a Stars Hollow address. And so like, she thought all these things through. She's considering both Lorelai and Luke and what they might want and need in a property, and realizes that Lorelai's house isn't enough for them both. And I think that's where Lorelai always falters. Like, it's perfect for her, but it's not enough for two people. I mean, granted, we see that they're kind of living in their house by the revival, but how much does Luke have to give up for that? How much does he have to store off-site? How much does he have to like not have access to? How little space is he working with to, you know, make improvements to the house and have a workshop or store his gear, right? And so I think it was nice of Emily. Like, yeah, Luke might have chafed at it, but in a lot of ways, I think she was right. And I think Luke kind of was on the same track with the Twickham house, where it's like, oh yeah, Lorelai, your house is great, but we need more space. And she's just, again, so unwilling to change, so unwilling to move. And the same flipping thing happens when she's with Christopher. Like, Emily offers her this beautiful home on a platter. It's like 3 acres of property or something, and a fishing pond, and a huge master bedroom with a fireplace and a sitting area, beautiful exterior Victorian architecture, wraparound porch, still very Lorelai, still very much her essence in this house. And Christopher does a similar thing in season 7. It's like, here is a perfect house. It's got a great yard. It's got a perfect room for Gigi, a perfect room for Rory. It's got big windows and natural light and a big kitchen with like open concept to the living room, lots of storage, beautiful built-ins, totally upgraded. This house built in 1790. And even the mailbox is apparently stunning, like carved out of a birch tree or something. And Lorelai's still standing outside like, yeah, it's the perfect house. And he's like, you don't want to move, do you?
Yeah.
So here she is, married to her high school sweetheart, father of her daughter, raising his daughter with another woman, trying to squeeze her into that tiny house and shuttle her back and forth between Stars Hollow and Paris. And here Christopher's like, let's have more, do more. Let's have another kid. Let's get more space. Let's move forward in life. And Lorelai's like, nope.
I mean, I don't blame her though. Again, it just, Lorelai was always going to fall back on those residuals of what made her comfortable. And that's not a bad thing. You know, I wish more people in life would acknowledge that, as opposed to trying to cater to whether it's parents, friends, partners, relationships. Like, you need to exist in a way that is going to be comfortable and allow for the lifestyle and the day that you want to have. If you can't, and you're just constantly living in a perpetual state of just, I'm just existing here because it's what this other person wants for me, but it's not good for me and my well-being, it's disastrous. So I will credit Lorelai all day just for always acknowledging what is going to allow her to, again, exist comfortably and in a way that is healthy for her. I think she should have factored in her partner's needs a little bit better, as opposed to, you always need to cater to me, but I can never cater to you and what you need. There should have been a little more give and take there and a little more meet me halfway, as opposed to Lorelai just expecting the men in her life to like go full tilt in her direction. That would have been a little bit better. But again, she was just always very cognizant of what she needed, and she communicated that when she wasn't getting it, and that's a good thing.
I mean, you make a good point about sometimes we don't need more. We don't all need 4,000 square foot new build houses with a 3-car garage if it's just like one couple with one car, no kids, we don't need to have these palatial houses as status symbols if we don't truly need the space. We can have what we need to be comfortable, like you said. But I think there's a middle ground between the potting shed and the Gilmore mansion that's like a step above Lorelai's current house. Because again, it was perfect for her and Rory. But now Rory is out of the house and Lorelai's looking to move forward in her life with a partner. And she's just so unable to compromise, like you said. Relationships require a lot of compromise. And if you can't bend for anyone ever, you really need to look at that in yourself and figure, like, it's one thing to be comfortable and it's another to be like, I never need anything more. Because you may not need anything more in terms of fulfilling expectations, someone else's expectations for your life, but to get married and have another child does require more. And it's not a bad thing to be like, okay, yeah, we need another bedroom. That's a pretty like mundane fact of life for a lot of people when they have to move out of their small apartment in the city to something a little bit bigger in a more affordable place. This is something we do all the time. We move for relationships. We move for children. We move for pets sometimes even. And it's not a bad thing, but Lorelai just is incapable. And sometimes I want to shake her and be like, just do something for someone else occasionally. My God, woman. You know, Max calls her out on it early on and she still doesn't change. Not even for Luke, the love of her life. She's like, yeah, sure, you can renovate my house. And that's as far as I'm going to take this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to move us along to other individuals in this show, unless you have anything else that you want to touch on with Lorelai specifically, and or Lorelai and Luke and Lorelai and Christopher.
I mean, I'm sure I could say more about Lorelai. Oh, I guess just like one quickie. And I'm certainly not the first person to make this comparison, but like, I think part of the reason she's so attached to that house is the fact that it reminds her of her childhood dollhouse. And like, she picked it because of this sentimental attachment. And then the sentiment just got deeper and deeper and deeper as she raised Rory there over the last however many years. And so, again, understand the sentimental attachment to houses, but she's gotta move on sometimes, and she never does. And I guess it turns out all right for her, but she had to go through a lot of heartbreak and break a lot of other people's hearts to get to a place with Luke where they could peacefully cohabit. So, but you're right. As much as I could probably say more about her house, especially the financial side of it, we'll have to probably tackle that in some other episode because people have talked about the value of this house and how she can afford it, and maybe we'll get to that someday. People have quoted it as like being a $2.8 million house or something, and I'm like, that's absolutely bonkers, and it's not true. Like,
yeah, no.
Where did you get that number? No. But I'll save that rant for a whole other episode sometime. Why don't we move on to Rory and her independent living situations, starting with the hub of the sofa in Digger Styles, where Emily comes in and redecorates her dorm room. Talk to me about Emily's move there and what it does to Rory's dynamic at Yale.
If anyone has ever seen Austin Powers, I'm going to draw on just a moment from that movie franchise and just say, how about no? And not even because it just was something that Rory would not want, but you're redecorating a space that does not only belong to Rory. It belongs to 3 other women as well. So as much as Emily probably does think I'm doing my granddaughter a solid and therefore her roommates a solid because I'm just giving them a more eclectic, upscale living space. I'm providing them with a television and other amenities within this apartment space and this dorming situation that they might not have. It's wrong of Emily to do it because who's to say, that Paris or Tana wouldn't have come in, especially I don't think Paris maybe would have bucked so much, but who's to say that one of the other roommates wouldn't have come in and just be like, what is this? Excuse me? I hate it. Who did this and who gave anybody the say to redecorate the space in this regard? That space needs to be a democracy amongst those 4 women for the year that they're living there. And Emily just completely disregarded that, just took it upon herself to redecorate, not factoring in the desires of any of those 4 women, including her own granddaughter. And as much as she thinks that she's doing all of them a favor and that it's a kind gesture, it was, I think, a really wrong and inconsiderate move to not even go to, even just ask first. Just be like, hey, I would like to do this for my granddaughter. I know that you 3 also share this living space with her. Would you be okay if I maybe got you guys all some better furniture and a television for the space? And maybe they would have said, yeah, we would love that. And then it's okay. But there was no consideration given. Emily Gilmore just did what Emily Gilmore does, which is what she always thinks is right because it's her way or the highway. And so she just made this decision autonomously, not factoring in what anybody else could have or would have wanted. And so, of course, Rory is going to come in and just be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe she did this. And Lorelai, too, is just like, I can't believe she did this. And their reaction is justified.
Yeah. Gee, I wonder where Lorelai gets it from with the whole my way or the highway thing.
No clue.
No idea. It doesn't run in the family or anything. But yeah, Rory says it, and she's right. It's an invasion of privacy. And how does she know that none of this stuff belongs to the roommates? Not to mention, how can we forget the microbe mattress situation? This furniture is probably provided by Yale, and they probably wouldn't look too kindly on people removing it and either disposing of it or putting it in storage even without notification. I mean, maybe she did go to Yale and was like, I'm refurnishing this room. You can store this until the end of the year and then put it back when they move out. But I don't know if she did that. And I think it's one thing to offer to add something maybe gift them the television and the stereo and the sound equipment. That's still a power move, That's what this whole thing was. And this is what she cites to Rory is just now you're in control. This is your apartment and they all have to bow to you because of what you've provided to them. And so it still would have been a similar power move if she had added those things without having to take away the other stuff. And without having to do it unanimously, unto herself. Or sorry, not unanimously, unilaterally. Yeah, no consideration given. And Lorelai offers her some, a good way to be like, you know what, Grandma, this furniture is nice. I appreciate the gesture, but this is a dorm room, and I can't guarantee that other people will love it as much as I do. And I worry about equipment getting stolen. It's just too much. But then she also counters her own argument by being like, actually, no, Emily's going to come back at you, being like, your grandfather and I are paying for you to go to Yale. I can't believe you would do this to me. Is your independence worth so much? And then Rory's like, I guess I'll keep the furniture. And it's never brought up again. It's, until the next year when the couch is being moved into Branford and Rory's like, yeah, don't wreck that couch or my grandmother will hunt you down. I'm not even kidding. Just delightful moment there, especially because it's one of a handful of times that a character of color or an actor of color is used and they're moving furniture. And Rory's like, my white, rich grandmother will punish you if you damage that couch.
Not problematic at all.
Not even a little bit. There's nothing problematic in this show ever. It's perfect and angelic.
No. And stay tuned, because one of these days we will have a problematic you-know-what episode.
Yeah.
But that'll be overflowing.
Yeah. I love what Lorelai says, though, at the end of that conversation with Rory when she first tells her about the refurnishing. She's like, take heart in knowing that when it comes to controlling a person, my mother targeted my soul, my independence, and my entire future. And at least with you, she threw in an ottoman.
What a spectacular. I mean, it's, again, problematic, but just what a spectacular and well-written line. And it's so truthful, which is even scarier. But you are right about Emily using that to wield power over individuals. I mean, because I even think to, you know, when Tana is watching TV and, you know, she acknowledges like, oh, well, we wouldn't even have this if it wasn't for your grandmother. So I'll abide by your TV legislation. If you don't want it on, I won't have it on. No.
Yeah.
If you want to watch TV, watch TV. You know, I don't know. It's just, it's not the first instance of Emily Gilmore using wealth and, yeah, just using wealth at its most basic to exert control over another person. I mean, that's what this show is based on. Like, we wouldn't have, like, it, we see it from the pilot. She has to fund Chilton, and she can't just do it blindly. She can't do it without strings. She has to do it with the condition of Friday night dinners, because there's the exertion of that control. And anytime, for the most part, that Emily Gilmore is doing something for somebody else, it's because she is trying, whether she knows or not, to exert that control. And then she capitalizes on it, and she demands that sort of allegiance and like holds it over people's heads. And it's just, if you're doing kind things for people for that reason, it's the furthest thing from the kindness that you think that it is. It's manipulative. It's narcissistic at times. We've talked about that. I'm sure we will more down the line. But Emily's revamp of the dorm room and the situation just fell in line with that.
Those are strings, Pinocchio. Yeah, it's always about control, and she uses wealth abstractly and materialism and classism as a way to control people. So yeah, it all tracks. But what about Paris and like Rory's cohabiting with Paris all of the years that she's in university, basically? Like, what's Paris's sort of lifestyle like in her? Because I also notice a little bit of that control in her. She's very type A. She's like, I remember when they move into Branford and she's delayed because Asher passes, and she comes in and Rory's already kind of like set some stuff up, and she comes in and changes things. Like, she even switches their rooms. So talk to me about the living situation with Paris.
Yeah, I think like what you said is true. It may stem more from Paris just being a type A individual, where she does want it to be her way or the highway, but not just because she's trying to pull in Emily Gilmore and exert that level of control. I think it's just Paris is so focused and needing to exist in a very specific and one-note sort of way, where it's just, I can't necessarily function well in life if I don't have XYZ lined up. And so it could just be even something as simple as sharing a space with Rory, just being like, oh, well, I need this room because, you know, the sunlight is coming in this direction, and because it's a space that would, you know, just drawing on the first year, maybe allow for a better situation for like a craft table, or for a cork board for my calendar, or for my plannings, or for my studying. And so Paris will disregard maybe what Rory has already established, but I don't think she's doing it necessarily in a harmful or controlling way, or in a similar sort of pattern as what we see from Emily. I think it's just Paris almost being so blind to other people's needs, again, not from a lack of consideration, but just from maybe so focusing self inwardly on what it's going to take for her to be successful. And we know that her success is so at the crux and the forefront of what she wants in life that she'll change things to allow for that, but it's not to be diminishing or harmful to others, but it's just because maybe in that regard she's unknowingly and again without fault or without negativity behind it, just so self-absorbed in her own success that she'll do anything that can allow for that.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. There's a situation that comes up in season 6 when, like, after she's thrown Rory out and then Rory finds out about the bridesmaids and comes back and wants to live with Paris again. She mentions that they never painted because Doyle didn't believe in improving somebody else's property. And she says, you should move back in, we should repaint. And I think it's like an interesting symbolic fresh start for her. And so it's another way, I guess, of using the control of her space as a way to exert control over her life, because now she's just broken up with Doyle and things feel out of control again. And it's like a way for her to kind of cling to something and to like strategically change something small to feel like she's controlling something bigger.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I think that sums up Paris to a T. It's what we see from her. Even when, they continue to live together after that freshman year, and they're maybe in an apartment that isn't as decorative or as furnished as what they got from, their freshman year. They still exist well together, but it's still just always Paris needing that space to be what she needs it to be. And she doesn't even do it only with Parrot or with Rory. She does it with Doyle too, where it's like, I'll hear your needs. I might concede to some of them. Some of that might seep into the brain, but at the end of the day, this living situation is going to be what I need it to be in order for me to exist well. In that regard, it just makes me think like there's a lot of similarity there between Paris and Jason.
Yeah.
And the two of them just being like, I'm not doing this from a level of inconsideration or because I don't care about the person I'm sharing a space with. It's just because I know what my own needs are and I need to have them in place, and I'm not willing to compromise on that.
Yeah, definitely. I see the parallels there. There's a few other just like moments I want to shout out real quick before we move on to our next person. I love when Asher gifts her the printing press and it becomes their new item of decor right in the middle of their dorm room. That's a fun moment. And then when Lorelai sees the off-campus apartment for the first time and she's like, no. Like it's so dingy compared to what they had before, and it's not in the safest of neighborhoods. I love when Rory's like, was that a gunshot? And she's like, no, that was just a car backfire. Like your hearing will attune to it. The real gunfire sounds fake. Like you'll get used to it. It's called ghetto ear.
Oh boy.
Yeah, again, a little problematic, but still pretty funny. But speaking of Rory's living situations in season 6 and 7, and Paris throwing her out, that's when she moves in with Logan Huntsberger, and we see his New Haven penthouse. First off, he starts in a dorm room where he has a roommate, and it's, a little more casual or whatever. But then by his final year of university, he's moved into his own place, and it's very swanky. And this is, Rory is 21 and living with a guy, and that's miles ahead of Lorelai. And I think it's interesting that she does that so soon. So talk to me about the cohabiting situation with Rory and Logan, and Logan's sense of style and how Rory exists within his space.
I mean, I'm sure Logan has some expectations for a living space, but I mean, let's be real. That was a living space that was being paid for by Daddy, that Mitchum was probably fronting the bill for. It probably already came fully furnished, fully decorated. If not, again, it was something that, the bill was probably footed for right off the bat. I don't necessarily, at least at the time that we see Logan and Rory in that season, I don't see Logan being the person that is just in there being like, oh yes, let's paint the wall this color. Let me see that shade of gray as opposed to that shade of white. I feel like he would just be like, just get the furniture, bring it in. As long as it looks nice, as long as it's upscale, it's fine. I don't see him being that nuanced or particular about it. And I feel like Rory was also the type of person at that time to like have higher expectations because she has now existed within the Emily and Richard Gilmore world for a few years now, where she's become a little more entitled a lot more entitled in ways. But I think, again, it was just more about being with Logan and cohabiting together. And I don't think either of them were too particularly concerned with the design aspect of where they were residing, as long as it, had all your basic amenities and had a bed and had a shower and a kitchen and was furnished. I don't foresee either of them just going to that level of extent and, trying to like Martha Stewart a living space and just being like, oh, that blender over there really doesn't match the feel of the kitchen. We need to change it. Let's try this. Like, I think they were just happy to be together and exist in the space that they were, but I don't see either one of them, especially, again, at the time that we get them in season 6, being too involved with interior design or caring a lot about it.
Yeah, he probably does have a designer paid for by the family. But I think there are things that are his stamp. Like, I noticed that both of his apartments, like the one in New Haven and the one later in New York, have quite a few references to sailing and boats. Like in the New Haven apartment, he's got a sailing ship, like an old schooner or something with like huge masts and big sails, like, but small model of it, obviously, in his windowsill. And yeah, I never noticed this until today when I was rewatching Partings, I think. He's got a chess table with 2 little chairs hidden behind like a pillar. It's often not visible. And so I wonder if he actually likes chess. And, he's a very smart guy. He's probably very skilled at it if he does. He's got a pool table in his New Haven apartment, but not in his New York apartment, probably because New York's more expensive. And by then his dad's company is footing the bill for that apartment. There's a lot of design overlap between them. They both have a lot of like exposed brick and grays and modern stuff mixed with historical elements. That's another thing I noticed, that sort of each of his apartments has some sort of historical artifact, like statues or plaques or things like that. Like in his New Haven apartment, he's got Henry, the suit of armor, which I love. In his New York apartment, he's got this sort of heraldic crest on the wall. It looks like it's made out of bronze or some sort of metal. I can't figure out what it is, but it's got like a lion and a cross and stuff on it. It looks quite old, but maybe it's not. I don't know. And then in his London apartment in the revival, he's actually got a sword hanging on the wall next to the bathroom. And I'm like, there's always some sort of little element that feels sort of medieval. And so I'm wondering if he's kind of a history buff and he just really likes, medieval England, and that's why he moves back to London, which I can attest is an amazing city. And if that's sort of his bent, then yeah, it's absolutely a good place for him. So you definitely see little bits of Logan in those places, regardless of kind of who picks the furniture and the linens and that kind of stuff. He's probably not too particular about the rugs or the curtains or the paint color, like you said. But you definitely see a little bit of his stamp. And I find his style is an interesting mix of sort of classical items. You know, his parents' house is very classic, and his style is a little more modern industrial, and it's a bit of a merging of those things.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Again, I'll echo what you said. I feel like Logan is probably the person who lifelong will just always have interior designers do that work for him. I don't foresee him ever. I want, like, I'll say, like, wasting his time. I don't think interior design is a waste of time. I am here for it all day, every day. But I just don't see Logan taking up hours of his day just being like, yes, let me go pick out the furniture that I want and what's going to look good here and what color should this room be and what's going to look good over there. I feel like he's just always going to be the type of person who, again, is just going to pay someone to be like, just make it look good. You have a basic idea of what I like. Here's a check. Go shopping, do it for me. But that's Logan for you. So
yeah, he's got the money to do it, so why not? But I guess that also brings us to the Huntsberger main house, which is flippin' stunning. Like, the exterior also kind of looks like a medieval castle. It's got some impressive stonework. I mean, it's night, so you can't totally see it, but if you like pause it and look closely, you can see some interesting stonework. The interior, there's marble columns and walls and marble inlay floors, impressive floral arrangements. There's a stained glass ceiling. And then Rory is particularly taken by the fact that they have a Velázquez hanging in their sitting room. And so this particular painting is called Infanta Margarita Teresa in a Blue Dress. And it's currently hanging in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. And so I'm like, how could they have, like, I don't know how long it's been there, but like, was it there when, when the show was made? Did somebody just not fact check who owned this painting or where it was? But it's this painting by a 17th century Spanish artist named Diego Velázquez. And it's one of his most famous paintings. And so if it was on the private market at the time, it was probably tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, because, again, it was one of the last paintings he did in the year before he died. So interesting little, like, the show is so bad at fact checking itself sometimes. Like, I was watching a bit of the revival earlier, and Rory calls Logan when she's at the park with Paris's kids, and she's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, it's 2 a.m. Like, you must have been sleeping." And I'm like, there's a 5-hour time difference between the Eastern time zone and London. I know this. My fiance lives in England. I've been doing this for a year. If it's 2 a.m. in England, it is 9 p.m. in the Eastern time zone. And you are outdoors in daylight, like solid daylight, with children. It is not 9 p.m. Did nobody fact check that? Anyway, rant over. But like, there will be more rants like this because, and the geography of Connecticut is another one that they just like straight up, nobody looked at a map of Connecticut before they made this show. But this, I think, might have been one of those things where they're like, we want something obscure to show off Rory's art history knowledge and also the Huntsberger well full at the same time. And so Diego Velázquez, okay? I'm sure they could have had like Basquiat's and other very expensive stuff as well. And it blows my mind that nobody checked. That's all I'm saying. How could that be a real one? Anyway, and I would like to point out that when Honor calls Rory from Thanksgiving, she's like, smoking has been banned from all 11,000 square feet of this house. I'm like, holy crap, this house is massive. It's got to be a multi-million-dollar mansion. And it's such an impressive set and an impressive house. And even Rory Gilmore is impressed. She's like, I'm a Gilmore. My family came over on the Mayflower. My grandparents have a pretty impressive house in Hartford too. And this is like echelons above.
Mm-hmm. You're not wrong with any of that. That house was next level, similar to how the Gilmore house was, and then some. Unnecessary, I will say. Just another blatant, ostentatious display of wealth. That's just, yeah. I mean, I don't love it, but
yeah. And then they've got multiple houses as well. Obviously, Logan offers her the family house in Maine to write her book. And we have the Martha's Vineyard episode where they go to that house, which feels a lot more cozy. It's still well appointed, and you can see beautiful art and sculptures and antiques and all of that. But it feels almost more like a mountain cabin with the exposed rock and the honey-toned woods. And it's got this beautiful outdoor patio overlooking the ocean. The bedroom Luke and Lorelai stay in is stunning, and it's got an ensuite with a big soaker tub. It's got its own fireplace. It's just another beautiful and impressive home, one of many I'm sure that they have littered all over the United States and possibly elsewhere in the world because they've got that much money. So again, with the displays of wealth, the Gilmores don't even have sort of a secondary residence. They rent whenever they go to Martha's Vineyard. And in season 5, they're like, maybe this is the time to buy a patch of land in Cape Cod, our own Kennebunkport. But they don't really do that until Richard passes and Emily sells the Hartford house and just moves to Nantucket permanently. So there's all of that. But I guess that's enough about the Huntsbergers. Because, I'm looking at my list and we still have several things that we haven't even talked about, and we're at 90 minutes. So let's move on to Luke, his apartment, and the diner. Is there anything that sort of like jumps out at you about Luke's living spaces and, how he shares the space with Rachel, how he shares it with Jess, the whole apartment hunting thing in season 2?
Yeah, I wouldn't ever say that Luke's living space was a bachelor pad, but he definitely made it a space that I feel like he was just very content to not ever have to share it with anybody if that was the case. And it's not that Luke is not averse to having women in his life and having a girlfriend and having a wife one day. Obviously, we see all of that play out. But I feel like Luke was just so, not always, because there was a lot of introspection that he did at times. But for the most part, I feel like he was always just predominantly secure and content with himself and with being a single man, that he didn't feel an overarching need every single day to have to just be like, I wish someone was here. And granted, it's not that he never thought that, because we do see him having bouts of loneliness and wishing that he had a partner. But for the most part, I feel like this was a man that was just would go upstairs at the end of every day after working at the diner and just being like, this space is what I want it to be. I feel like just average to anyone who's watching. It's nothing to write home about, but it doesn't need to be, because it's what most people have now, like in a living space. Like you have a bed, you have a kitchen, you have a living room, you have a bathroom and basic amenities, and he's good with that. Like he didn't need anything above and beyond that. And so I applaud him for just the contentment that he felt within his own space, and just that security that he felt when Jess shows up and he needs to accommodate him, and when Rachel comes into the picture and he needs to accommodate her, when Lorelai starts spending the night sometimes. He's not unwilling to change. He's willing to make those accommodations to allow for another person, as long as it's not going to significantly change the entirety of the space that he exists in. He's fine with putting a mattress down for Jess. He's fine with maybe getting a bigger bed or a bigger mattress to accommodate a partner so they both can sleep in the same space. But I feel like it was just very much his own, and he was happy with it, and he's not unwilling to share it with somebody else as long as there are no major changes.
Yeah, he's a very sentimental person, and I think it was a smart financial decision for him initially to turn the office into a living space when he was young and single, and sell off the family home after his parents passed away so that he could take that money and bank it and live simply. He's a minimalist. You see that he doesn't have a lot of fancy stuff and he doesn't need a lot. And so it was good for him to live kind of minimally for a little while. But as he starts getting into his mid-30s, Lorelai starts sort of prodding him, especially once Jess arrives, to be like, now you have a teenager living with you. You need more space. You need a bigger apartment. This isn't something that can just be solved by inflatable mattresses and storage bins and another dresser. You need somewhere else. And not only that, but like your apartment screams bachelor pad. You have a single bed. It says, there's no room in my life for anyone else. And he takes that to heart. So I find it interesting and hypocritical of this to come from Lorelai because, it runs counter to her own interactions with Luke and with Christopher. The table's turning. This place is too small for one person who has a life, but her house is actually pretty small too, and she's very resistant to doing anything with the spaces in her house to make better use of them. Like Rory's room kind of just sits as it is. It's not quite the same thing because at least it's a house with a second bedroom and apparently 2 bathrooms. I don't know where the hell they put a downstairs bathroom, but that's a whole other rant. But now she's saying that he should move out of a place that holds so much nostalgia for him and has been functional in his life so far because it's not just his apartment anymore. And I mean, can you say hypocrite? That one you can say 5 times fast. You know what I mean? It's rich coming from her. Because, he's so into the nostalgia. He keeps the diner the same and resists even painting it or sprucing it up or decorating it for holidays. It's just, he's not really into that. And Lorelai is the one who comes in and paints the place and starts to like shake up his life. And then on the other side, she can't take her own advice.
Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts about this. And most predominantly, I want to save them for when we do our episode on grief and loss, because I feel like a lot of these thoughts will tie in there. But I feel like Luke was so unwilling to change the space in terms of, the lower part, like the lower level and the diner aspect of it, but also the upper living space. Even though it was previously a hardware store, I just feel like maybe he was so scaled back and hesitant to make changes because it was something that belonged to his father and that he still has just sentimental feelings for in terms of how it was as he knew it, not wanting it to change because it means moving on from a level of comfort that he's always known. Again, a lot of these thoughts will tie into that grief and loss episode, so I don't want to extrapolate on them here or dive too deep into them. But I feel like it is a very common thing for anybody to be hesitant to make changes to a living space when you're trying to move on from something. Because when you make those changes, maybe it feels like you are dismissing that person's existence, how they had previously set up that space. I feel like maybe a lot of what Luke was hesitant about with making those changes stemmed from perhaps an underlying grief that he still felt in dealing with the loss of his father.
Yeah, you make a good point about comfort. I think, our homes should be places of comfort and security. But that doesn't mean that we can't be comfortable or secure in other physical spaces. Like change isn't inherently going to remove comfort. And I think a lot of people resist that idea quite a bit. But it brings me to maybe ideas of physical comfort. A fun example is Babette and Maury's house. That house is basically built to scale for someone who's like 4'11".
So you.
And Maury is 6'6". So, I love how she's talking to Lorelai about how, he got a couple concussions when they first got together and he first moved in. I think that's adorable that, Maury was literally able to make himself fit into Babette's life so that they could have their sort of little small town idyllic life together.
Yeah, it's just amusing. Like, and you can even see it when Lorelai is in the kitchen and just how low the counters are and how you don't even have to reach up for things. If anything, you're probably reaching down for things. And it was just built for, yeah, people who are just shorter and
like me.
I
would love that house. I need those lower countertops.
Oh yeah, that would be perfect for you. Yeah. And so it probably was designed for either a person or a couple, who both were just, maybe only 5 feet tall, maybe short. So like they needed that accommodated to them. But it is just comical and amusing now that Babette has a partner that's just like, you might as well be a giraffe in this house just because like duck down all the time. So yeah, I do appreciate the comedy aspect to that.
Yeah, I think it's adorable. Another Stars Hollow place that's kind of interesting to look at in terms of the use of space and family dynamics in a house is Kim's Antiques. We've got the antique store on the main floor, but it's also a primary living space for them. It's where they eat. The kitchen is still a functional kitchen, and the living room is full of antique furniture. And it almost feels like it reminds me of the Room of Requirement from Harry Potter, where it's just like stuff accumulates over time. But I think the more interesting part is actually Lane's room and what it says about her and how she kind of has to hide her identity under the floorboards and in the closet, and how she tries to carve out a space and an identity for herself in a physical space that is like not conducive to her at all. I think it's very reflective as well of what Lorelai went through growing up in the Gilmore mansion. This is obviously a more modest example, but her mom's decorated the whole place with crucifixes that have to be taken down and replaced with Buddhas when her mom comes to town. That floorboard lifestyle really runs through the Kim generations. But I find it interesting that Lane literally kind of has to live in the closet, which is a very strong metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, first off, it's unrealistic that I think her mother never discovered anything in that closet whatsoever.
Right.
There's just no way. Like, Mrs. Kim could sniff out if a Snickers bar was present in that household. So you're not going to tell me that she never noticed all of the stuff that Lane had going on in her closet. But it's just sad, again, that she raised her daughter in a household where she felt like she was existing in a space that was so diminishing and so black and white and didn't. What'd you say?
Stifling.
That's a very good word. Yeah, I'll just go with that. Black and white and stifling, and just didn't allow for any growth for Lane. She tries so hard when she's there to break free, even doing things like dyeing her hair purple, even if it is only purple for a very short period of time before she does it back. But we see very small periods of growth for Lane and her trying to like break free and push through that glass ceiling that her mother has placed upon her with regards to that household. But for all of the creativity and the internal passions that we know exist within Lane, and then to have to exist in a household and in a room and in a space that is designed in the way that it is. And I'll go back to the word you said, because it's, I think the best word choice, stifling. It can do, I think, a lot for a person's psyche and for their well-being when your, own personal desires and creativity and passions are being clamped down in that regard. And Lane never had any space to explore that side of herself and to make her room what she wanted it to be, other than her closet. And to have to hide it is such an abhorrent thing. So I'm glad when she was able to move out and, maybe have a little bit more openness and say in that regard. But even when she was living with her bandmates, it was still just like, I never saw her making any space that she was in her own.
Her room there was a little more decorated to her taste, but she was financially limited in what she could do with it. And she was more interested in the band and the placement of her drums and them not being stuck in the closet like they are when she's pregnant. She's very much dedicated to that. And the independence of living with the guys, I think, did a lot for her. So it was good to see her express her independence in that way and to actually live independently with other types of people. So that was good for her. We're like really running long on this. I feel like there's so much more I could say. Your page count update for this week, dear listeners, 67 pages. So I feel like there's still a lot we haven't talked about, but I just want to give a quick shout out to Paris's Manhattan brownstone from the revival. I want that house. Give me that house. I mean, maybe put it in an elevator. I know Doyle didn't want to because he didn't want to destroy the architectural integrity of it. But Paris calls it a vertical Armageddon. And, I'm lazy. I don't want to do all the stairs. But just like the blue velvet, the beautiful furniture, the stunning dining room with the crystal chandelier. I love that house.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that as well. Upscale, but what I think worked well for the two of them in that moment. Elevator aside, getting in her steps is never a bad thing. So just, leg day, folks. I don't know.
But it's how they lost a bunch of nannies because they wouldn't take the kids up and down all the time. Like, it was a pre-Civil War brownstone in Manhattan. So, that was mega bucks. And just, it's so beautifully appointed. And they have the funds for nannies and all of that. So clearly they're doing well for themselves. But then they split and he moves to an apartment in Tribeca. And she keeps this brownstone and she's like, damn it, I left my glasses 3 flights up.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the most convenient house, but it's very expensive and impressive. So I'll give them that, but not the most functional. And then I had a whole section at the end that was sort of a little more about Stars Hollow itself and like how, not just our actual domestic circumstances impact us, but the larger picture of like where we live. But we've kind of talked about Stars Hollow a little bit in the past, and we will talk about it again in the future. I just find it interesting, just how pleasant it is to live in. And again, don't really blame Lorelai for not wanting to leave because it is a great community. It's very walkable. It's very well laid out. Kind of everything you really need is there in the town center. It's perfect for community building. It's not suburban and sprawling. It's just a kind of delightful place to live. And, we've been to Hartford. Not all of it. We haven't seen all of it. We've kind of like driven through a few like bigger parts of it. But it's like I can see why Stars Hollow is more appealing than living even in a mid-sized city like Hartford. So just the bigger picture of place. So like your individual space within the larger context and space, and kind of how that impacts you as a person. And we see what happens when people come out of that place, like when Rory goes to Yale, and then as her life progresses and she moves off to New York eventually and goes on the road with Obama, and how her worldview opens up when she gets out of a place like that. But she still loves the comforts of home. Yeah, as a giant homebody myself, I can totally appreciate like having a space that feels like you and makes you comfortable and happy and allows you to function and be the best like version of yourself. So
yeah, I think we got that from a few of our characters on the show, not as many as I would have liked. Again, I feel like that's predominantly for the purpose of this conversation. One of the things that I feel like quite a few of our characters needed to work on better. It's communicating with the person that you're living with. Again, whether it's a roommate or a parent or a partner, about the space that you are cohabiting in. Like, it doesn't just have to be a partner. If you're rooming with, a college roommate, or again, even just a relative, no matter who it is, you need to make that space your own. And it needs to be a space that you can exist in and feel comfortable in and flourish in. And if you can't do that, you either need to move out and find your own space, or you need to be willing to have that sit down and that talk with the person that you're living with and just being like, hey, this space doesn't work for me. What can we do to make it something that is good for the both of us? And see if that person is willing to make that change and have that discussion with you. And if you can, great, and you can exist together, wonderful. It doesn't always work that way. I mean, we're winding this down, but I will say, like, my first semester of college, my roommate and I butted heads constantly over everything. And it didn't stem from interior design all the time, so to say, but that was a part of it, because I would want to do something or make this change. She hated it, vice versa. It was not a good situation for either of us. And at the end of that semester, we both agreed we can't room together anymore. Sometimes that just happens. But case in point, no matter who you're living with, you need to design a space that is going to be healthy and good for the both of you. And if it can't work, find a situation that will work for you, because at the end of the day, you need to live in a space that's going to be good for who you are.
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to customize a place to your tastes because, like, you have to. And it's another to be Emily Gilmore and throw $40,000 to finally get your paws on the pool house that you've been wanting to update for years, and now you finally have an excuse. And you do a mid-century modern, young, fresh update to your pool house and turn it into a sex house. See how we brought that full circle? That was fun.
We're good at that.
Yeah.
Do you have any other thoughts before we wind down this one? Because we have been going for just shy of 2 hours now, so we should probably start to wrap it up.
Yeah, only about a jillion. But I guess we did sort of promise to talk about Suki and Jackson, and I think it kind of plays off of the point you just made in terms of, like, have that conversation with whoever you're living with about, like, hey, how can we make this space work for the both of us? Because once again, Suki unilaterally is like, it's too feminine in here. It needs to be more masculine. I'm going to paint the place blue and bring in all of these things like a giant bear and like a trout for over the mantelpiece. If she eventually talked Mrs. Kim into actually selling it to her. She just goes ahead and does it. And Jackson's like, I'm fine. Like, I'm good living here. But at least she thought about trying to integrate someone into her house. And she tried to be considerate to the fact that maybe pink's not his favorite color and he doesn't want to see it every day. So I think her heart was in the right place, but she just went overboard.
Yeah. I would agree. I mean, and Jackson has always been really good about kind of going with the flow with things. But I think there was even a conversation that needed to be had between the two of them and just being like, hey, let's not go off the deep end here with designing this too far on one end of the spectrum that's going to make the other person so uncomfortable. And as much as Jackson and Suki are very good at, I will allow you to do what you want to an extent, I think even they hit a point with the design aspect of things where they both just needed to sit down and just be like, you're going too far here. You're going too far here. Let's talk about this because this ain't flying anymore.
Yeah. And I also love that Lane and Zach eventually buy that house because their little one-bedroom apartment was not big enough for them and the twins. And so it's another one of those situations where more space and more amenities are warranted when your life changes and when your family changes. And so it's only natural to upgrade a little bit when you need more space. Something Lorelai clearly has not grasped.
No, not at all.
So I think I have to cut myself off there because, my babbling capabilities are infinite, especially on stuff like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is definitely your forte. I know a topic that you can gush on forever. But I do think we should probably call this one here. We always have thoughts that we can and we'll circle back on. We're not anywhere near the end line or the finish line. We still have multiple episodes down the pipeline, so we'll get back to some of this. But what is coming up for us next week on the Gilmore Way?
One of our earliest episodes was about generational traumas and like sort of the cycles that we tend to go through, repeating each other's mistakes. And we're going to kind of riff off of that a little bit, maybe talk a bit more about it, and also talk about generational differences. So like, Emily's ideas from, the early to mid-century about what a woman's life should look like versus Lorelai and the third wave feminism. We've got Rory, who's a millennial, so we'll probably be talking a lot about the 30-something gang. So just kind of looking at the different attitudes and beliefs that are brought to the table by these three generations of women especially, but the other kinds of things that are imposed on the characters in the show by the writing or by society culture.
We promise that we will try and keep that one to under 1 million hours as always, but no promises with us. It's Gilmore Girls. We always have a lot to say. In the meantime, while you're waiting for that episode, please go back and watch some of our old episodes. We've had a really good slate of ones that we've done in the past few weeks, in the past few months. We've had some special guests on. Go check out some of those. And again, we continue to plug it because it gets closer all the time. But as of this recording,
2 weeks-ish to FanFest. Yeah.
2 weeks to FanFest. It's real here. It's happening, folks. It is not too late to buy a ticket to this event if you would like to attend. Whether you only can go for a day, whether you want to go for the entire week, buy a pass and get yourself there. This is the Gilmore Girls weekend for you. And go on Sunday because
we're running Gilmore's Against Humanity. So if you love What Do You Meme and Cards Against Humanity, we're doing a Gilmore-fied version. And it's breaking my brain a little, but it's going to be fun.
Yeah, we'll make it happen. I think it's going to be a really good time for anyone who attends, but we have links in the description below if you want to check out more info about that event and buy a ticket. As always, again, in the meantime, go back and watch some of our old videos if you want more content. Go binge Gigi because we are officially in September now. It is rewatch season. The time has come. We are all awakening, from our slumber. Go just
the pumpkin spice is flowing.
Yes, indeed it is. So just go, just absorb yourself in Gilmore Girls. It's never a bad thing to do. And as always, please just remember to do all of those YouTube things for us. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel. It just takes one click, a couple seconds of your time, and it really does help us out. And we're always so thankful for it. In the meantime, again, enjoy the fall season. It is amongst us now. It is when we flourish.
My favorite month.
Yeah. And until next Friday, enjoy your week, and we will see you then for dinner.
Bye.
Bye.
Sorry for a 2-hour recording.
We're not sorry.